The idea of being a writer is quite appealing to most. Being able to create stories on your own schedule and make tons of money is what most people dream of, but very rarely do people consider the disadvantages. I had been writing for about 10 years at this point, and the lack of success as well as the unbearable isolation had begun to take its toll. Most relationships didn't last, aside from my editor and a friend or two from college. My family stayed in touch, but they had their own problems to deal with. I was severely depressed. My city life mixed with self-isolation and mild addictions had begun to weigh far too heavy on me. If only I had a moment of clarity, time away from all the nonsense where I could think clearly, perhaps I could finally tap into my true potential. I sat in my therapist's office early afternoon, feeling emotionally drained but oddly inspired. Dr. Kelsey had hardly spoken this session. He mostly nodded while responding in question form. The answer to me was simple: write one hit, a single novel to get me on everyone's radar, and all my problems would just melt away. At least that's how I viewed it. Dr. Kelsey reacted strangely when I mentioned this. He just sat silently, his thick brow furrowed as he observed me through his glasses. "What will it take for you to find this inspiration?" he asked. His gaze landed softly on me as he wrote furiously on his leather-bound notepad. I paused, thinking what I could do to change, but I was already doing what I thought I could do to become successful. I stuttered as I fumbled with my thoughts. I'm not sure. He motioned as if he was about to speak, but quickly caught himself. The wheels of my mind spun as the unbearable silence began to affect us both. I glanced at the clock, hoping our session was over, but we still had 5 minutes. I don't know. Yoga? I blurted. Dr. Kelsey smiled and sat up. Yoga is great, but how will that inspire you? How will that get you to think differently? To change your perspective on things? Sometimes we have to change our environment. I nodded. I had been cooped up in the city for so long, and for good reason. The end of fall had been colder than usual. That, and I hated nature. I had grown up my entire life in the city. Chaos for me was pretty standard. The concrete jungle provided comfort and familiarity. Something I knew was holding me back. I glanced up at the clock again, this time signaling our time had in fact ended. Yeah, I'll try to change my environment. Maybe I can get some fresh ideas. I leaned forward to stand up, but Dr. Kelsey kept speaking. Next week I'll be out of the office, so we'll need to push our appointment to the week after. But I am going to follow up with you and ask what you did differently. Sounds great. We both got up and I left the office. I pondered my session as I went out into the cold and into my car. The brisk air briefly pulled my thoughts from myself to the weather around me. It was a dry cold, but snow had yet to make its presence this year. Thankfully, frost had yet to form on my windshield, and I started up my car and cranked the heat. I thought as to what I could do on my drive home on changing my environment. I didn't want to go camping, because frankly I didn't know how, but I was open to doing something involving nature. Traffic was tolerable for once, and I was able to park my beater car in my apartment parking garage. I entered my cold complex, and the familiar smell of the old building greeted me. Baxter, my old French bulldog, sat by the door when I opened the apartment. "Hey, bud," I said, as I rubbed his head. My overall mood was low, but Baxter was able to give me a slight boost with his excitement. I sat down on the couch and looked for Airbnbs for cabins or homes out in the country, but most of them had been booked for the upcoming holiday. Alternatively, the ones that had not been booked were very expensive. However, there was one property that was still available. A cabin about 60 miles from the city appeared to not only be open, but also at a really good price. The only thing about it though was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It didn't have Wi-Fi, but it did have electricity, which is all that I needed. My excitement got the better of me, as I didn't bother reading any of the reviews. The cabin was a single-story A-frame home that looked furnished by a cozy decorator. I briefly read the conditions, and if I'm being honest, I overlooked a good number of them. I just made sure that pets were allowed, which they were. Without thinking twice, I booked the place for the coming weekend, going through next week. I instantly received an email saying, "Thank you for booking," and a receipt and a map to the cabin's location. Again, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the email, and I went about my day with a false sense of accomplishment. In the meantime, I tried coming up with a good ending for my story, but the inspiration I'd so desperately been needing was once again out of reach. The next 2 days were more of the same, just anticipation for the upcoming trip, as well as mustering false motivation to finish my story. The day of the trip came and I got up early. I had packed the car the night before. Baxter was just as tired as I was, but he sluggishly followed me out to the car. It was still dark out. I pulled out of the parking garage to see soft snowflakes slowly descend. The sun had yet to rise, but the busy city was beginning to come to life. I drove slowly through the city and eventually made it to the highway. By this time, my car was finally warm enough that I could stop shivering. I pulled up the maps to the cabin as well as listening to a book on tape. Baxter sat in the front passenger seat, trying his best to fall back asleep. The highway had its fair share of drivers, but that slowly dissipated as I headed towards the country. However, as fate would have it, I could see cars piling up and streaks of red on my maps. There was a crash up ahead. The freshly fallen snow always seemed to provide inconvenience, especially those that didn't know how to drive, or better yet, to everyone else that did. But not all was lost. I could see an exit right before the crash, although it would take me on the back roads to get around the wreck. I pulled off the highway and onto the back roads that I was fairly unfamiliar with. I checked the rear view to see that I was the only one. My maps updated, taking me on a significantly longer route to get to my cabin. I sighed and took another sip of my now lukewarm coffee. The back roads that I drove on had homes spaced apart, but not much else. We were now entering an area where I didn't see too many people. The homes were older and more ran down the further I drove from the highway. Trees became more apparent as the back road seemed to cut its way through. The sun struggled to burst through the clouds as its light was muffled by the thick snow. Although visibility was poor, the landscape slowly became more beautiful and deserted. My frustration slowly was replaced by serenity, an odd peace that I hadn't experienced in quite some time. I even turned off my audiobook to appreciate nature's first appearance to me, although on a darkened background. Snow began to fall more heavily as thick flakes fell with the wet mass on my windshield. I had to slow my speed as the roads became more treacherous. I wasn't anticipating having to drive on the back roads to get out to the country, although I should have at least expected the snow. I turned my wipers on full blast, and my high beams on as my vision became more obscured. This went on for about an hour when I saw a strange light coming up ahead. The angle of the light was unusual, as if it was coming from the shoulder of the opposite side of the road and pointing up. I slowed my speed as I slowly realized what I was seeing. They were headlights coming from a ditch. The roads were so desolated, I was rather surprised to even see anyone. But what shocked me more was that it appeared that this person had just been in an accident. I pulled off to the side of the road and put my hazards on. Normally I would just drive past, but seeing how that we were in the middle of nowhere, I felt obligated to make sure that help was at least on its way. I got out of the car, which I made sure to leave running for Baxter, and walked across the street to the crashed car. The car itself seemed to be in good condition, and it was still running. The car probably just slid off the road, I thought. I peered down from the road to the inside of the car, and surprisingly enough, it was empty. I glanced around hoping to at least see someone, or perhaps a car coming, but it was clear that I was all alone. Did someone pick them up? And if so, why did they leave the car running? I walked closer to the car just to confirm that there was no one else inside, when I saw a startling sight. Inside the car on the driver's side was blood. Blood everywhere. It was as if someone was bleeding out in the car and drove into the ditch. The passenger door was open but faced away from me. My heart began to pace faster as I slowly realized that something sinister had happened here. I could see blood leading out into the woods, as if someone inside had been dragged out. I began to shake from both the chill and from the growing dread that fell on me. I made sure not to touch anything, but I inspected the car as morbid curiosity began to grow. I dialed the police to report what I saw. Thankfully, my service still worked out here. A woman answered and asked me what the emergency was. I told her my location and that how there was an abandoned car covered with blood inside. Surprisingly enough, she was rather calm. I guess that's her job. I was then told that 2 cruisers would be sent out my way, but it would take some time due to the snow and the location. I wasn't planning on waiting, just sitting here, but I told them that if they needed anything else from me, that they could come see me at the cabin I was staying at all week. Perhaps that was a mistake on my part, but I was just curious. Perhaps they'd give me more information if they came and checked up on me. I reported the incident and got back in my car, and Baxter greeted me. I put the car in drive and my wheels spun for a few moments before finally catching traction, and I continued my drive. My once serene drive was now becoming one of apprehension. My mind was trying to process what could have possibly happened for such a scene to have occurred. I thought of numerous possibilities, but none of them were pleasant. Surprisingly enough, I was rather close to the cabin that I had booked. I hadn't even noticed. About 15 minutes later, I saw a dirt path on my right that entered the dark woods. The driveway was poorly made. The snow made it difficult to see where to go, but thankfully, I was able to piece it together as I saw the cabin in a small clearing. I pulled up and let out Baxter to use the bathroom. He was a pretty good dog, and the area, despite the snow, was fairly clear for him to run around. I went inside and the cabin looked just like the pictures online. It had a fairly modern design. On the small coffee table there was a small gift basket. It had an arrangement of treats and candies that one would normally find from a host of an Airbnb. Alongside the basket was a handwritten note. I grabbed one of the Kit Kats out of the basket and began to open it as I read the note on the table. Rules of the Cabin was its title. The first couple of rules were pretty standard. Clean up after yourself, no smoking inside, turn off the heat when going out. Things that almost go without saying. But then, the more I read on, the more bizarre things were. Don't go outside when it gets dark. Keep the blinds closed when you're in for the night. Keep the door locked. Don't whistle when you're outside or draw attention to yourself. Don't answer the door past midnight. I picked up the note and read it again, just to make sure I was reading it correctly. It was clear that whoever owned this place was a nutjob. Probably some old superstitious couple. Whatever, it wasn't a big deal. Most of the weird rules didn't even affect me anyways. I mean, why would you need to close the blinds or lock the door if I'm the only one out here? And why couldn't I answer the door past midnight? I finished my Kit Kat and stared outside. I brought in the few items I had brought with me and went outside to check in on Baxter. I could hear him barking out back, which made me a little annoyed. I went around the cabin and saw him losing his mind, barking into the woods. Maybe he saw an animal. "Whoa, big guy, it's fine," I said, trying to calm him down. I glanced into the woods to hopefully see what he was barking at, but all I could see were the isolated woods. I noticed that in some areas of the woods, some of the older trees had darkened trunks, probably due to there once being a forest fire, but other than that, everything looked normal. There wasn't anything out there, at least what I could see. I picked him up and went inside. He had trouble calming down, but once inside he seemed fine. The day went by slowly. The overcast of clouds seemed to linger longer than they should have. The cabin didn't have Wi-Fi, but that was okay. I needed to focus on my story. I started the gas fireplace in the living room and typed away on my laptop. The isolation from distractions made things new for me, but that was the idea. I pittered around ideas and concepts, but nothing truly inspiring came forth. I was beginning to make progress when a soft knock came from the front door. I turned my head and looked at it. I felt uneasy. I slowly got up, questioning what I heard was real, when I heard it again, this time slightly louder. For the first time in a while, I wished I hadn't got rid of my gun. It was a low point in my life. Dr. Kelsey said it was probably a good idea to let him hold on to it for me, just in case. I inched forward to the door and slowly opened it. To my surprise, 2 police officers stood on the other end. "Good evening," the older officer said. "Are you the one that reported the crash just down the road?" I let out a sigh of relief. Yeah, that's me." The 2 nodded. "Well, thank you for calling that in. Can we ask you a couple of questions?" he asked, hinting to come in. "I don't have a lot of time, but I can answer what little I know." The 2 came in and Baxter walked over to say hello. "I'm Officer Donahue and this is my junior partner, Officer Higgins." Higgins spoke. "So you found the car empty with blood everywhere. Did you notice anything else? See anyone else?" I shook my head. "No, I just saw the car in the ditch and pulled over." "Okay. Is it just you here?" Kind of an odd question, I thought. "Yep, just me and Baxter," I smiled. "Have you been out here before?" "No, I haven't. First time." "We'll make sure you stay warm and try not to venture too far off into the woods. Very easy to get turned around and lost out there. Had a poor couple last winter hike too deep into the..." Officer Donahue caught himself. "Well, I'll spare you the details, but we didn't find what was left of them until spring." I nodded. "Good to know." I glanced at my watch to subtly hint that I was done with this conversation. "Well, we'll be in the area for the next couple of days. Here's my direct line." Officer Donahue handed me his business card, and both left out the front door. I didn't care for cops, but these 2 were just clearly doing their due diligence, making sure that I wasn't going to be another case for them. The sun hadn't yet set, but it might as well have. It was dark, although it wasn't even 6 yet. I hated the winter. I let Baxter out as the 2 cops pulled away, and I waved, trying to be polite. Thankfully, Baxter was pretty quick with his business, but instead of coming towards me, he just stared into the woods again. What was his deal with this damn woods? He didn't bark this time, but his focus was dialed in. I tried to call him over, but he didn't listen. He just stood there, posted up right before the tree line again. I walked over again slowly, cursing under my breath as I shivered my way over. In Baxter's defense, he hadn't seen the woods before. I did see the appeal for it, its beauty, but he was acting so strange. I picked him up and went inside. I was too cold and it was too dark to try to see what was going on out there. I cranked up the fireplace, got the cabin nice and cozy. I made myself a hot chocolate and watched the snow fall from inside the cabin. The clouds seemed to part as the moon glowed in the cold night. I pulled up my laptop and went to work again. The wind also seemed to pick up, as I could hear faint howling through the trees. The later it got, the more tired I became. I made sure to turn off the fireplace and had a quick snack before bed. I closed all the blinds on the windows. Personally, I prefer to keep them open, but today was a weird one. Too many weird things happening, and I didn't want to risk breaking one of the superstitious rules. I went to my room and Baxter followed. he always slept with me. I laid in bed and played on my phone for way too long. I tried to close my eyes, but something about being in a new place was playing games with my mind. I couldn't get comfortable for sleep. I just closed my eyes and tried to meditate when I heard something coming from the front door. It was brief, but I definitely heard it. It wasn't quite a knock, but a soft tapping on the front door, like someone tapping their fingernail on the metal door that separated me from the outside. Baxter shot out of bed and began barking. He ran out of the room and over to the front door. I laid in bed petrified. Something was definitely out there. Had Baxter just laid quietly, I would have tried to ignore it, but seeing how he was out there, a disturbing idea crossed my mind. Did I lock the front door? I sat up in bed pondering if I'd remembered to lock it after coming in from taking Baxter out. I slipped out of bed slowly and approached the door. Baxter was no longer barking but stared at the door handle. I rushed over and to my horror the door was unlocked. I locked it immediately and stared at the door, praying that our nightly visitor was just some weird sounds. But all suspicions were confirmed when I heard the handle slowly turn. The handle jiggled briefly. Had I not gotten up and stood by the door, I wouldn't have heard it. But even worse, whatever was outside would have been able to have gotten in. An idea had crept into my mind, one that I couldn't ignore. I should peek out the window and see what was standing on the other side of the door. It was against the rules, but I just had to know. I had to be sure, or else I would not have been able to calm down the rest of the night. I could hear on the front porch the wood creaking from weight being shifted. Someone was definitely out there. I walked over to the window and paused. I tried to calm my breathing, but my anxiety made it nearly impossible for me to calm down. Tension continued to build as I slowly peered out from behind the curtain. It took me a second for me to process what was out there. My mind wasn't prepared for what horrors lurked just outside. At first glance, I thought it was a woman, due to it having long strands of unkempt hair, but as I watched it pace, I realized it wasn't human. It was bipedal and had similar features as a person, but it was naked out in the cold and mangled in every way that shouldn't be possible. It then turned and faced me, revealing a horrifying disfigured face. Its flesh had been melted, as if it had been caught in one of the forest fires. Jagged teeth filled its gaping maw, undoubtedly able to kill. For a moment we connected eyes. I turned away quickly, hoping that the brief interaction would go unnoticed by the creature, but I couldn't be sure. I moved silently to the kitchen, fumbling around for one of the officer's cards to find his number. I sat behind the counter and called, praying that he would pick up. It was 1 a.m. The ringing went to his voicemail and I whispered in the phone that something was out there. Right then, as if the thing could hear me, it began slamming its weight into the door, shaking both the frame and the small cabin. I let out a shriek of fright and hung up the phone. I grabbed Baxter, who was barking furiously at the door, and went and hid in the room. I wasn't sure what to do. I hid under the bed and tried to pull Baxter under with me, but he resisted me. I then heard the door break and fall in the cabin as something stepped inside. Baxter ran out of the room, leaving me all alone under the bed. I feared for his safety, as he was now out there with that thing. I laid under the bed cowering, knowing that it was only a matter of time before I was found. I could hear Baxter bark out in the living room, and I braced myself for the worst, but to my surprise and horror, I heard a long and soft shh. Baxter had been shushed by the thing. It didn't want to kill him. It wanted me. I heard footsteps on the floor, searching around the apartment, undoubtedly looking for me. Slowly they made their way back to my room, and I could see its feet slowly enter the doorway. It walked over to the closet and opened the door briefly, peering inside. I held my breath as it was now mere feet away from my face. The smell of rotting and burnt flesh filled the room. I tried not to gag on the odor, but I was overwhelmed. I then expected it to turn to me and drag me out with its claws, but rather, it did something more terrifying than what I could imagine. It then hid in the closet, closing the door. I was amazed at what was happening. I couldn't do anything. I laid under the bed, not breathing, not blinking, just staring ahead, hoping that whatever this thing was didn't come out and look under the bed. What felt like hours were probably only seconds. The thing wasn't just hiding, it was waiting. I didn't know where Baxter went, but I just hope he was okay. I laid under the bed all night with no sleep, or even the possibility of distraction to comfort me. Certain death waited only a few feet away. Several hours later, when the sun started coming in through the windows, my heart dropped as I heard my phone ring loudly in my pocket. I tried my best to press the side button on my phone from outside my pocket. It only rang twice, but I knew it was too late. I then could hear the closet door slowly creak open. Officer Donahue and his partner arrived at the cabin around 8 in the morning. The seasoned officer shared with his partner the disturbing voicemail he had received from the witness earlier that morning. Both officers were unfazed, since this wasn't the first time that this had happened to someone staying out here. The sun was shining as the two exited the cruiser. They saw that the front door was broken, laying on the floor inside. The junior officer drew his weapon, but Donahue corrected him. "She won't be here. She only comes out at night." He put his weapon away, but heard shuffling coming from inside the cabin. He almost drew his gun again, but quickly saw it was the French bulldog of the witness from yesterday. Its paws and muzzle were covered in dried blood, but appeared to be uninjured. Donahue sighed. "So weird. She seems to ignore the pets. I wonder why that is." Donahue picked up Baxter and began walking back to the cruiser. "Well, this winter is off to a rough start. Let's file this case as another missing person."
This has left me feeling extremely shook, and I'd love some opinions, especially from someone with experience. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog. I was driving pretty far into the Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's isolated, so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy and rough drives into the parks sometimes, and lack of service and assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road, kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but I didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge, and I noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with a dirt and gravel road. Yuka, my dog, starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled maybe. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continue to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be going more than 5 to 10 miles per hour up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices. They sound close, and I think I should call out to them. So I stop my car, but then kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere. I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for where the voices could be coming from. I've never ran into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how Yuka was acting on the way down. I was scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. I decided to spring for a luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself, and the voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die, glass gets broken. Nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dogs in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain. And it's honestly kind of interesting to me, as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information, as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year, I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. I've Googled the national park once, and I didn't see anything, but to be fair, I didn't look much. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination in this little event. So my boyfriend and I were coming up on finishing our road trip just yesterday. We were in Wyoming for a wedding. There were only 2 to 3 hours left, and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and ended up on a True Stories video dealing with Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog, playing Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly, he says what they are, and casually mentions that they can mimic voices. I mean it when I say the most horrible chills I have ever had in my life crawl down my spine, and I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me that I was probably close to a Wendigo. I remember him saying that, but I didn't know much about their lore, and I thought he was just being funny like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no, I mean I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you could not find a trace of. I feel strange as fuck, and I start Googling Wendigos and whatever else. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they would live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is, "Another family goes missing in Mendocino." And I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they are all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remembered looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and realized these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found, on top of many which are found dead. It just has my intuition super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there terrifies me, and I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing, and still do to this day. My dog and I are very close. She was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing her home from Costa Rica, so her little growls along the way makes me feel like there was something wrong. even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I have done a lot of solo traveling, both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seemed strange. I don't think I'll be doing more solo travel unless it's around civilization. Does anyone know about authentic Native American lore? Or has anyone else had a kind of inexplicable experience like this? Extra points if you've had bad vibes in Mendocino National Forest from a Wendigo.
The early morning sun poked through my window, letting me know that it was time to get to work. I yawned and stretched and put on a pair of shorts with a t-shirt. I could hear the cardinals chirping hello to the serene August morning. It was already in the mid-60s, which meant that a very warm and humid day would be on its way. The kids would be here soon, and I needed to make sure that everything was ready for the weekend. As the sun inched over the horizon and burned away the morning haze, I checked the cabins and found everything in place for the new campers. The food was packed, the cabinets and the freezers and the mess hall stocked enough for a large contingent of children. This would be the last weekend of summer camp for the year. Once these kids were gone, the Boca Nature Reserve would be shuttered and forgotten until spring returned to claim the reserve from winter's icy grip. I checked the list that Roger had given me at the beginning of the camp season. I went through the list of participants and stopped at the last unchecked date. This weekend, I would help host the boys of St. Michael's Orphanage. No, sorry. We don't use the word orphanage anymore. Political correctness sent out a memo calling St. Michael's a foster child care center. Doesn't really matter what name they give it. St. Michael's houses all the unwanted children from broken and abandoned families. These children were the modern-day wretched refugees the Statue of Liberty talks about on its face. If not for the sizable donation from the Joseph Swift Foundation, these kids would never step foot in Camp Winoka. They were truly the lost souls. If not for a few caring individuals, they would have slipped through the cracks of society without a concern. For most of the camping season, snot-nosed rich kids ran around Winoka like they were personally responsible for nature itself. They were privileged, spoiled, and couldn't care less about communing with nature and its wonders. The upside of those little rich kids was the money that their parents shelled out for us to entertain and amuse those rotten brats for a week. Their cash kept Camp Winoka running and afforded the opportunity to bring in less fortunate kids for camp. Although, most of these young souls had never been out of the city, and they appreciated the communion with forest life. After 30 years as camp caretaker, this was my payment, seeing the wonder in their eyes when presented with the majesty of nature. With everything in order, I jumped on the camp's ATV and drove back to my Airstream trailer nestled off the camp proper. Looking in my bathroom mirror, I was a little unkempt. I swept back my salt and pepper hair, tied a rubber band around my ponytail, as well as brushed out my beard, dabbed on some deodorant, and slipped into a clean yellow polo shirt with the camp crest. It was around 8 a.m., and the camp would soon come to life with new explorers. I fired up the ATV and went to the base camp to await the last campers of the season. I had just finished a Red Delicious when I heard the bus rolling down the dirt road. The Winoka Nature Reserve was an isolated slice of forest in the southeast corner of Ohio. It covered over 400 acres of privately protected woods and wildlife. Hiking trails wound through the forest without a telephone pole or a skyscraper littering the landscape. The cabins, mess hall, and even the suspension bridge across the Taylor Ravine were all built with solid 19th century ingenuity. A single dirt road was the only way in or out of the reserve. Roger was the first off the bus as usual, He was filled with energy and covered in summer sweat. Although most counselors were teenagers trying to add a community service star to their college transcript, Roger had fallen in love with Camp Winoka and decided to make it a yearly commitment. He was an able-bodied guy, so I appreciated the help. "Hey, Jackson, how's it going, you old mountain man?" Roger thrust out a hand. I shook it. "Everything's primed and ready to roll." While the other counselors tended to the kids, Roger slung an arm around my neck and walked me away from the unloading bus. "Listen, Jackson, there are about 22 kids this year. All boys, so we'll use cabins A, B, and C and leave cabin D empty. There are a couple of rowdy ones, but nothing that you and I can't handle. After all, if we can't handle 24 kids for 3 days, we're in the wrong business." He laughed and looked at me with a concerned expression. "How's your arthritis?" Good days and bad, Roger. But nothing to keep me out of the game." "Oh, that's good to hear. I'll get with you when the kids are done settling in, and we can go over the schedule. Here's to a great weekend." He slapped me on the back and returned to the bus. The kids unloaded and settled into their assigned cabins without incident. From the checklist Roger gave me, the kids were 9 to 13 years old, most in the lower part of the age range. Just like every year, we gathered them around the mess hall for introductions before Camp Winoka lunch. "Good afternoon, campers," Roger cheerfully bellowed, met with a semi-enthusiastic hello by the campers. "My name is Roger Lovek, but you can call me Roger. I'm the head counselor here for your stay at Camp Winoka, and this," he pointed to the 4 yellow-shirted counselors, "is Gary, Glenn, Mitch, and Tom. And this right here is Mountain Man Jackson," he pointed to me. "He takes care of the campground all year round and keeps it looking great. If you ever have a problem during your stay, please let myself or one of these men know. We're here to make sure that you have fun as well as stay safe." Roger glanced at his clipboard. "And with that in mind, we do have a few rules." The children heaved a collective sigh. "Oh, come on, guys. These rules are here for your protection. The nearest city is about 45 minutes away, as well as the nearest hospital is over an hour away. Play safe, stay safe, right?" Okay. Rule number 1. Everybody needs to be in their assigned cabin by 9 p.m. When we are in the wilderness, the temperature drops out there and there are no streetlights, so it gets really dark and very cold quickly. Rule number 2. Every camper will be assigned a buddy. Your buddy is to be with you at all times. Well, unless you're going to the bathroom. Everybody chuckled at this. Rule number 3. Unless you're being led by a counselor, stick to the blue paths. If you look in your packet, you'll see that the paths that I'm talking about. Blue paths are safe to walk with your buddy. Red paths are trails approved for walking only with a counselor. And the black paths are off limits and are for staff members only. All right. Rule number 4. Trail bikes, paddle boats, and canoes are available on the first-come, first-served type of basis. The sign-up sheet is located on the bulletin board outside of the main cabin there, and we put up a new sheet after dinner for the next day of unscheduled activity time. And before you ask, the ATV is for counselor use only. Rule number 5. Be respectful of your counselors and fellow campers. We have opened this once-in-a-lifetime chance to enjoy nature, so take advantage of it, not the people around you, and have a great time. What do you say? The kids offered a civil round of applause. Roger waited for the smattering to die down. And this year, we're offering a special surprise to the best campers. We'll be choosing 6 of the best campers for a Sunday night excursion to the Light of Hope ruins. Some kids smiled and nodded. I can see some of you know the legend, but we'll be camping there for a night with an open pit cookout, some s'mores, and maybe just do a little ghost hunting. How's that sound? The kids erupted in applause and whistles. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Great. Be on your best behavior, and you could be one of the lucky few that are chosen. Now, let's get in line for lunch. We have a lot to see today. The kids continued to applaud as they lined up for their afternoon meal. I never minded putting meals together when I was in the Army, so it was an easy task. Every day, One of the counselors was assigned to KP with me. Unfortunately, they usually bitched and moaned about it. I never understood the attitude. I mean, get it over with. Don't drag it out by complaining the whole time. Besides, these kids were grateful to have a bologna sandwich, fruit cup, and celery with peanut butter. It was those rich kids that had special menu requests that were the real pain. Needless to say, there are no vegetarians when you're poor. The next couple of days flew by without incident. I'll be honest, I've never seen a group of lightly supervised kids not get into a little mischief when the counselor wasn't around. I guess the Light of Hope campout was a real draw for those of you who do not watch those ghost hunting programs. The Light of Hope ruins are one of those places that have spawned many supernatural myths around them. This made life hellish for me. As a matter of fact, I spend the majority of my off-season time running off idiots with their ghost detecting equipment because if anyone gets hurt, the sanctuary would be liable for any injuries sustained. Nevertheless, it never stopped anyone from spinning a yarn about a campfire or two about the place the media calls Gore Orphanage Light of Hope. The campsite was located 3/4 of a mile from the main campground, close to the interstate annex. The 6 winners were easy to choose and were elated when we called their names at the Saturday night assembly. The kids were a bit skittish due to the fact that we had to take one of the black paths through the dense woods, but Roger and I made sure that they tucked their pant legs into their socks to prevent ticks and chiggers from getting a free ride to the campsite. "Mr. Jackson, what's that close to the campsite?" A kid named Connor Watson pointed to the woods where a clearing appeared. "See those old markers? That was a graveyard over 100 years ago," I said. "That's creepy." The boy had a worried face as I patted his head. Don't worry, Connor. Ghosts don't exist. You're safe for now." And I offered him a wink. We made it to the site about an hour before sunset and set to the task of putting up the 2 tents. Each tent could fit 8 people comfortably, but was a bit of a pain to set up due to the remnants of the brick and stone left from 100 years ago. By the time that we had them up, the sun was mostly melted into the horizon. The 6 winners were a bit rowdy and anxious, but we kept them occupied. Roger took half the kids out to forage for wood for the campfire, while I took the other half to help prepare dinner. Although Connor was not too happy about deer stew, the others were unaffected. Mark Treasure acted almost ghoulish in his desire to try it. We set the gallon pot above the healthy fire, even though every kid was thinking about Gore Orphanage. None of them asked about it, and by the time that we were ready for s'mores, they were practically chomping at the bit for a ghost story. I served the kids some homemade apple cider. I warmed it over the fire to keep the cold away while they finished their chocolate graham cracker marshmallow treats. Roger decided that he would begin weaving the supernatural tale, and asked, "So, has anyone here heard of Gore Orphanage?" All hands went up, but when he asked if anyone knew why it was called Gore Orphanage, most of the kids shrugged. Well, late back in the 1800s, there was an orphanage located on this very spot. You've seen the bricks and timbers lying around our campsite, right? And they all nodded. It was a huge building that once housed almost 200 children. It was originally called the Light of Hope Orphanage. And I jumped in. Now, these kids that they took in weren't good kids like you. They were mostly runaways and kids that weren't right in the head, and some were downright mean. But they were too young to go to prison. So the authorities put them in Light of Hope for rehabilitation. You kids know what that means, right? Some nodded intently, listening. That means that they hoped that the orphanage could help them become good, productive citizens. But some just couldn't be rehabilitated, Roger sighed. Some children were dangerous and had to be chained up at bedtime. Some children were locked downstairs in the basement and were only allowed out for an hour a day. The worst of them were isolated in a small, lightless part of the basement and never allowed to play with the other children. The people who ran the orphanage were too afraid that they might hurt the other children. The worst of them was a kid by the name of Lowell Frudd, I continued. Think of the meanest kid that you know. Now, times that kid by 10. That's how mean he was. Nobody knows what made him so mean, or if he was born with the spirit of the devil with him. His first night in Light of Hope, he bit off another kid's ear. They tried chaining him up, but he picked the locks and hurt other kids. So they put him downstairs, but he got free again. This time, he hurt a kid so bad that by the time that the orderlies got him to the infirmary, the kid was almost dead. Lowell had broken every finger and toe in the kid, joint by joint, added Roger, accentuating this by breaking some dry sticks and tossing them into the campfire. As you can guess, Lowell had become far too dangerous to leave around the other kids. The people in charge decided to lock him away in the basement. They put him in a straitjacket and only let him out for a shower once a month. When they let him out to take a shower, they'd also wash down his cell. Let's just say he didn't have the cleanest of bathroom habits, I continued. But how did he eat? Connor, the youngest of the Winters, asked. Good question. See, once a day, an orderly would bring in a bottle of liquid food, oatmeal or gruel, and force a tube down his throat. They'd empty the bottle straight into his stomach. That method worked until he bit off one of the orderly's fingers. And after that, they had to strap him down to feed him, Roger said. Oh, come on. Mark Traeger, the oldest of the Winters, rolled his eyes in disbelief. It's true. A quick, serious look put Mark Stout in check. They used an old, rusty C-clamp to force his mouth open. Lowell fought them, but only succeeded in breaking off pieces of his teeth. They found records where orderlies refused to feed Lowell because of his creepy, jagged-toothed smile. Oh yeah, I forgot about that, Jackson. Roger hit a laugh at my improvisation behind a cough. Everyone that came in contact with Lowell was convinced that he had the devil in him. But what could they do? The only way to leave the orphanage was either through an adoption or when they turned 18. People knew that no one would adopt Lowell, and it was many years before he was old enough to legally leave. So in that basement cell he stayed. And as years passed, I concluded. Roger suddenly stood up. Sorry, boys. I gotta go relieve myself. Jackson, do you mind finishing the story? I don't know, Raj. You think that they can handle the rest of the story? The children responded with a chorus of protests. Okay. I'll tell you the rest of the story if you guys promise to clean up afterward and hit the bed. Deal? And all agreed, and I passed around the rest of the steaming apple cider while Roger headed into the woods for some privacy. After a few years in the hole, the orphanage people relaxed and let Lowell out of the straitjacket. They even let him eat real food instead of pouring gruel down his throat. It looked like he might have actually turned the corner and was going to make a good young citizen after all. However, he had these eyes that looked like the houses of the fires of hell. It unnerved everyone who met him. But he was behaving, so he got more and more privileges back, although he was still kept in the basement. Then, on an August night, Lowell picked the locks on his shackles, and any other person held prisoner for years would have made for the doors and escaped, but not Lowell. He went to the storage shed and got several cans of kerosene. Back then, kerosene was used in lamps instead of light bulbs that we use today. He crept through the night, poured gallons upon gallons of kerosene all around the building, in the hallway and other places that could move without drawing attention to himself. He poured a final trail of kerosene out of the main door and wedged a piece of lumber across the doors, jamming them closed. Then he put a match to the kerosene, and the boys gasped, and they were hooked. And in that night, much like a night like this, Lowell Frudd laughed as he watched the orderlies and children helplessly pound on the doors and windows as the flames grew taller and hotter. Survivors say that he sat down on the front lawn and watched it all burn to the ground. His eyes red, glowing, smiling his broken smile. "Ah, what a bunch of bull," offered Mark. "No, you think so?" I asked. "Here are the facts, young man. On that August night, only 17 children and an orderly survived. By the time fire trucks responded, it was too late. All the firemen could do was watch the Light of Hope orphanage burn to the ground and listen to the dying screams of the trapped orphans. In case you've forgotten, you're sleeping on the ruins of Gore Orphanage. Oh, and here's one other fact that I should share. The children all held their breath when they asked in unison, 'What?' Lowell Frudd's body was never found. The local sheriff's office searched the woods for a week, but they found no survivors, nor did they find Lowell. The only trace of Lowell was where the survivors said that he was sitting on the lawn. A single word was burned into the grass. Home. People say that Lowell roamed the Winoka woods like a wild animal until his dying day. Some say his spirit still haunts these woods. And on a certain night like this one, you can hear the wailing of an orphan child, warning the living when Lowell is lurking about. Wait. Listen." The kids looked at each other as the night sky covered the woods in darkness. Only the occasional cracking of the fire interrupted the silence. And almost on cue, a thin, high-pitched moan filtered through the surrounding trees. What was that?" Connor sputtered. "I have no idea," I said flatly. "Just stay near the fire." It was then that I saw Connor's mouth wide open, pointing towards the woods, and one by one the other kids followed his finger. In the tree line, 2 small red orbs, the size of human eyes, glowed, and from the thing in the tree line came a single guttural word. The children froze. Their panic drenched the area. The thing advanced again, and they all began shrieking but huddled close to the fire. Mark even pulled a partially burned stick from the campfire and held it in front of him. It repeated, drawing closer to the campsite. The children were seconds away from blind panic. "Lowell!" I exclaimed. "It can't be." The thing burst from the tree line and into the light of the campfire. The children offered one more unified scream before realization hit them. It was Roger. "Got ya!" He laughed, walking up to the Ghosts Don't Exist campfire. He showed them his glasses with the red LED lights and sat down on the log next to the fire. "You kids should know better." I couldn't contain my laughter. "Ghosts don't exist." The kids offered a weak protest to the prank, but Roger and I couldn't stop laughing. And once the adrenaline surge died down, the kids complied with our wishes and went to their tents. Roger and I made sure all the boys were secure in their sleeping bags before we returned to the fire. "That worked better than I thought," said Roger. "I didn't believe you about the moaning thing." Earlier this week, I had told Roger about how the trucks driving on the interstate close to Gore Orphanage caused a sound which, when filtered through the dense forest, sounded like an otherworldly moaning. Many paranormal investigators reported it as evidence of ghosts, but it was quickly debunked as passing big rigs. However, we were going to take advantage of any free story elements that we could. "Did everybody have their fill of cider?" Roger looked at the stack of empty cups. "No problem there." I stood and stretched. "We got a big day tomorrow." "Game over." "Is it?" Roger smiled. The kids slept like logs. Roger and I found it difficult to wake them. In fact, I guess that I had put too many sleeping pills in the apple cider. The next morning, the kids made their groggy way back to the main camp and prepared for the return to St. Michael's. I smiled and waved at the children whose names that I would soon forget. Well, maybe I'd remember one. I'm sure the bus ride back to St. Michael's was uneventful, with the exception of the winners regaining their wits long enough to ask where their fellow orphan was. Roger would handle it with his usual charm, like he had done in the previous years. Probably some excuse like an asthma attack or spider bite from a brown recluse or some such nonsense. It didn't really matter. There were always a new batch of bright-eyed junior counselors every year. A missing child on the books, and an additional $60,000 went straight into the administrator's pocket. All the angles were covered. Orphans were the lost souls of society and would never be missed. Roger rejoined me later that day. We strolled into Cabin D with uncontrollable grins. Connor Watson's eyes, a mixture of uncertainty and terror, lay beyond the weeping in the corner of the cabin. I told you, Connor. Ghosts don't exist. But monsters are real. I drew my knife and closed the cabin door.